Okay, well, good afternoon. I'm Rob Atkinson, president of ITIF. I want to welcome you to this event today on a really compelling topic. There's going to be a bill on this book next month in Congress when they return, the Evolutionary Economy Act. It's S1 and HR1. See, being flipped here, there's sort of a broad topic here. We want to talk about economic theory and economic policy writ large, so it's really encouraging that you would turn out to this. I want to introduce, first of all, our panel, and then I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about basically what I was trying to argue and found in this little book that we just released today, or releasing today, Understanding and Maximizing America's Evolutionary Economy. We'll hear from our three respondents just for a few minutes, for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. We'll adjourn at 1:30. Let me just start by, first of all, Eric Beinhocker on my far left. By the way, I should say this is a fantastic panel for me because it's three folks that I have an enormous amount of respect for. They're the kinds of thinking they all do on innovation and economic theory is really outstanding. If you don't know their work, I encourage you to really follow it. Eric is the executive director of the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford. He holds a number of positions at Oxford as well. INET Oxford is a research center devoted to applying leading-edge interdisciplinary approaches to rethinking neoclassical economic theory. He's also a senior research fellow at their Blavnik School of Government and a number of other posts. But where we got to know each other, prior to coming to Oxford, he spent 18 years at McKinsey & Company, where he was a partner and held leadership roles, including in its strategy practice and McKinsey Global Institute. Mike Lind is the policy director at the New America Foundation, which he helped found a long time ago, 15 years ago probably. If you don't know Mike's work, again, I really encourage you to look at it. Mike is a prolific, unique in one sense because he's a wonderful, wonderful writer. And combines that with real deep policy and political insight. He's a co-author of a number of books, including The Radical Center, The Future of American Politics. He's authored a number of other books, The American Way of Strategy, Oxford University Press, a number of other books, as well as, I didn't realize this, Mike, until looking at you, several volumes of fiction, so you're iconoclastic. But his most recent book, which if you haven't read, I really strongly encourage you to read it, Land of Promise, An Economic History of the United States, published by HarperCollins. And Eric, your book is not on here, which I also found a fantastic book, which was, remind me the title again.
The Origin of Wealth.
The Origin of Wealth, thank you. If you really want to understand what's called complexity theory in economics, you really should read Eric's book. And lastly, who is joining us by phone today is Richard Nelson, professor of economics at Columbia University. Richard, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you just fine.
Beautiful. So if you don't know Dick Nelson's work, you're missing out, I think, on really one of the best economists in the 20th century. When I was getting my doctorate, I had his book that he wrote with Sidney Winter, An Evolutionary Theory of Economic Change, on my desk, and it was really an inspiring work that helped my whole thinking about economics, which he had written that book back in 1982. It was so far ahead of its time. So he's renowned for his work on industry, economic growth, the theory of the firm, and technical change. He's also the George Blumenthal Professor Emeritus of International and Public Affairs and the director of the Program on Science, Technology, and Global Development at Columbia. It's a long background. He was at the RAND Corporation in the late 50s and 60s. He was on the President's Council of Economic Advisors in the John F. Kennedy administration. In 2005, he was awarded the Leontief Prize by the Global Development and Environment Institute. And in 2006, won the 27th laureate of the Honda Prize. So we're really honored that Dick can join us today. So I want to jump in and talk a little bit about the concept of evolutionary economics and why it's important. So we could just so why do we care about this? I think we care about it largely because the economy is not a real thing in one sense. Economy is really a conceptualization. It's what we think it is. At one level it exists out there, but what is it? How does it work? How we conceptualize that has big implications for how we conceptualize policy. So this is sort of one view of the economy. You can read any of the business press. They're always talking about, well, is the economy heating up? What are jobs doing? Should we get the boiler going, cranking a little faster by lowering interest rates? Or is it cooling down? So this sort of machine metaphor is one dominant metaphor about the economy. So another one, which is another metaphor, is, well, the economy really is just a vast set of exchanges. It's a vast marketplace we all engage in. We go and we pay things. We have willing buyers and sellers in labor markets and product markets and a whole set of other things. But really, when you think about it, I think a much more effective way of thinking about what an economy is as an evolutionary system. And we don't think about it that way because we don't see evolution because it's so, in one sense, slow. We see it occasionally. We saw it 3 weeks ago when Apple came out with the iPhone 6 Plus. So new phone, new operating system, bigger phone. Everybody can kind of get that. But what they don't get is that process of constant change is going on. So this is based on last year's numbers. I'll just estimate for today. For this year, today there'll be 620 patents issued. Companies in the U.S. will issue 424 new products. They'll adopt 439 new production processes, new ways of doing business, new ways of making things that weren't in existence yesterday. Also, on average, there'll be 3,800 firms go out of business today. And luckily, there'll be 4,000 that'll be born. So each day, there's this rapid churning of new kinds of firms, new kinds of technologies. This is just an example of that using census data on firm births and death by industry. And what you can see by that is some really dynamic patterns. So look at the top gray line. That's information, the internet firms, publishing firms, things like that. And you can see through, say, 2000, the dot-com explosion, if you will, we were increasing firms, the births were exceeding the deaths by a significant amount. But since then, they've been declining every year, not because the industry's not healthy, not because the industry's not competitive, but because of consolidation and firms are getting bigger in that industry. Now you compare that, say, to the light blue line, manufacturing. That started to fall off in terms of net births and deaths much earlier, basically in '98, and it's been negative ever since. That's not because of consolidation. Actually, average manufacturing firm size is getting smaller. What's happening is we're losing competitiveness, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and so we're getting fewer firms. And so you can see that finance is another one, growing, growing, growing. 2008, when the financial collapse happened, started to decline, and now appears to be coming back. So this dynamic process of different growth rates for industries is constant. And we see that, again, just going a little deeper. Credit intermediation firms, firms that take in deposits and give them back to borrowers, growing, growing, growing. And then early on, actually before the recession, before the Great Collapse, you saw a decline in that, and it continued through 2009. Okay, keep going. This is an interesting one, books, periodical and music stores. This is a pretty serious continued decline, and no surprise there. We all get our music on iTunes or other places. We get our books on Amazon or Kindle or Apple. So this industry is continuing to go down because of technological change. Keep going. This is one I think is interesting, specialty food stores. So, I just went last night to Whole Foods because it's on my way home, and my wife said, get some dinner. Those sort of food stores, as people value healthier foods, as we get bifurcated incomes, those kinds of food stores are growing dramatically. Okay, keep going. So, the idea is that the economy is evolving at a pretty regular rate, and it's transforming itself. Well, how should we think about that in terms of economics? Sort of the patron saint of evolutionary economics is Joseph Schumpeter. And this is a sort of iconic quote from his most famous book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. The essential point to grasp in is that in dealing with capitalism, we are dealing with an evolutionary process. New markets, new methods of production, new forms of industrial organization. So he wrote that in essentially mid-40s, and it's still obviously true today. So what is evolution? When you think about, actually, let me add one more quote to that. By the way, you want to just go back? There's another great quote I think that's also enlightening here, and that's from Dick Nelson's book with Sidney Winter, An Evolutionary Theory of Economic Change. And they write that the broader connotations of evolutionary include a concern of processes of long-term and progressive change. That's something that really fundamentally economics, conventional economics, whether it's Keynesian economics on the right or neoclassical on the left or neoclassical economics across the spectrum, it doesn't really think about long-term. Neoclassical economics is much more about short-term. Keynesianism is about the business cycle. And what Dick Nelson and Sidney Winter are talking about is an evolutionary longer-term process. They also wrote in their book that said that they were aware that what they were writing was challenging what they called orthodox economics. And they wrote, many of our economist colleagues will be reluctant to accept the second premise of our work, that a major reconstruction of the theoretical foundations of our discipline is a precondition for significant growth in our understanding of economic change. And I'd love to hear from Dick when we get to his comments whether he thinks after 40 years after that book came out, or I guess 30 years, whether that has actually happened or not. I would argue it has not happened, that conceptual rethinking, although I think it's now in the process of happening. Okay. So what is evolution? Evolution really is fundamentally three things at the end of the day. It's improvements in productivity. Can we make more things per unit of hour of work or per unit of economic input? If we can, that's evolution. But it's also the development of new welfare-enhancing products, services, business models, new ways of doing things, new products that are going to add value, whether that's a new drug development or whether it's a new app on your phone or a new car that drives itself. That's all evolution. And so lastly, it's about increasing global competitiveness. So if your economy evolves to become more competitive, that's evolution. Now, I pointed out here welfare enhancing. And the reason is because I think in contrast to what conventional economics thinks, I would argue that from an evolutionary perspective, you can actually have economic devolution. Two examples of that, I would argue. One is in the last decade or so, let's say 2011, U.S. manufacturing declined significantly, not as neoclassical economists say, because we evolved to a higher order knowledge economy, but because we lost core capabilities, partly from, to use this evolutionary metaphor, from predation, foreign mercantilist practice, and partly from our own inability to evolve our companies in an adequate way. We devolved as an economy. Another good example of devolution that obviously everybody was talking about a few years ago, and that's the introduction of financial products that were leading the financial system to make bad decisions, some of the CDOs and other kinds of derivative products that led to bad investment decisions. Anyway, for folks in the back, there are chairs up here if you want to just come on up. So devolution can occur, and what you want, obviously, is an economy that doesn't devolve but also evolves. So what drives evolution? And just to be a little provocative, one of our reviewers, by the way, really took offense at the last phrase there and thought I would mislead people, but I don't know why I would mislead people with that. There are really three, if you think about it logically, there are three forces. So one is Darwinian, if you will. In other words, competition forces organizations, whether they're for-profit or non-profit, forces organizations in an ideal world to continue to evolve. If they don't evolve, they will be eaten by predators and they will die. That's what we see. Lamarckianism, if you're familiar with your biological theory, Lamarck was the competitor to Darwin. Lamarck said that giraffes get taller because the trees grow taller, and then they pass that genetic mutation on to their offspring. It actually turns out Lamarckianism isn't as crazy as you think. There is actually evidence for some Lamarckianism in biological evolution. But Lamarckianism is just the notion that firms themselves can get better on their own because they want to get better. But the last, obviously, is intelligent design. In other words, can there be some being on the top that drives and directs evolution? And clearly there is, and that's what's called society or government or the state. And the state has a clear role through history, as both Eric and Mike and Dick have all talked about. Government plays a role in intelligent design. Okay. So let me sort of switch gears a little bit and then say, well, how does evolution play out in the economy? What are the drivers in the actual economy? Those are the drivers kind of at the organizational. What are the drivers in the actual economy? And I'd argue there are three main drivers of economic change and economic evolution. One is geography. We tend to forget that. From a global level, there is no geographical change, right? All our economic activity occurs on the planet Earth. We don't offshore things to the moon yet. But within particular economies, geography matters. So in the old economy in the US, we used to have what were called seedbed functions, places like the Northeast, which generate new industries, new ideas, new products, and they would diffuse throughout the rest of the economy to low-cost places like the South. You had low-cost production, you develop something really, really great, you commoditize it, it'd be easy to make, you'd move it to some low-cost place. That was a process of geographical evolution within the US that predominated really until the 1980s. Now what's happened is that geographic evolution occurs at a global level. Things that are produced here in the US and get to commodity stage oftentimes then are moved to low-cost countries, whether it's a call center in India or making Happy Meal toys in China. And so if you look at some of the factors here, you see these are industries that appear to have lost real output from 2000 to 2010, largely because of geographical evolution. They just evolved, moved offshore for economic reasons. Okay, keep going. So there's a second driver, which is really the fundamental driver of all three, and that's technology. Changes in the knowledge base we have that allows us to make things differently or to make new kinds of things. In the past, and you'll see this with Eric's slides a little bit, innovation really before the ICT revolution tended to be materials-based. It tended to mostly affect the goods sector. Today, ICT, because it's a general purpose technology, affects all sectors, is enabling this genetic mutation in all industries. We see it in all these kind of media, news, retail, services, banking. These are all now being transformed in a genetically mutated way, if you will, because of this new technology. Okay? And some examples of that. Industries that have grown because of technology. Software publishers, 1998, 2012. Primary battery manufacturing. It's largely because battery technology has gotten so much better. We're now producing Tesla batteries and the like. Support for oil and gas operations. That's all about technology for fracking. Wireless communications up 700%. Again, that's technology driving it. But also a whole set of industries that are losing because of technology. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember this, but when I was a child, we would, or when the TV tube would break, we could look in the back of the TV, you'd see a tube that was dark, and you'd go to the store, and you'd stick your tube in this thing and test it, and then you'd buy a new tube and come back and stick it in your TV. Thank God we don't have to do that anymore. But electron tube manufacturing is down 55%. Somebody still buys these things, obviously, but videotape rental. Remember when we all went to Blockbuster? Postal service. That's a technology decline. We're all shifting over from paper to electrons. So again, you can see these technology drivers create growth, but they also create decline in particular industries. And lastly, an evolutionary driver we overlook is just changes in culture, changes in society, changes in government itself. So it turns out that one of the fastest growing industries, you go to the next one, one of the fastest growing industries in the U.S. is tortilla manufacturing. Now, I don't think that's because we invented better tortillas or we somehow made better tortilla machines. I assume it's because of two things. It's that Americans are becoming more akin to liking Mexican or Hispanic food. And secondly, we have more Hispanics living in the U.S. So here's a cultural driver that's changed this. One of the fastest growing industries in the last decade was armored vehicle and tank components. Well, what's that all about? That's all about us being in two wars where there's a lot of unexploded devices and we need to protect our troops. And so we're making a lot more armored vehicles than we ever did before. Fitness and recreation centers, up 70%. Not many industries yet that declined, but one that's declined, obviously, newspapers. Argue that people are losing interest in the news. Hey, Dick, I can hear you. I don't know if you can mute for a little bit, but that would be if you can. Okay, next one. So let me just move on to policies, and then I'll just close. I think the key kind of findings or takeaways, I think, if you will, from this report is one. We need to move beyond the neoclassical and Keynesian playbook. They're valuable in certain areas, certain aspects. They're not enough. Secondly, markets, again, while valuable, are not enough. Third, there's, I think, a growing resistance to evolution, a fear of evolution in the U.S. And I think resistance is a little bit like if you watch Star Trek, resistance to the Borg is futile. You can't really resist these things. You just slow down positive evolution. And so I think evolutionary economics can be the guide, and to do that, I think we need to think about sort of 8 different kinds of principles. 4 that are around, if you will, Darwinian and Lamarckian policy. So one is about global integration. More global integration drives evolution, particularly in innovation-based industries, in part because of economies of scale. Second, we need to get out of the way of natural evolutionary gain and loss. When Tesla goes to New Jersey and say, we want to sell cars directly, and the car dealers say, no, we don't want to lose, we don't want to die, we don't really like this new environment, we want to preserve the old environment. When government sides with the car dealers over the innovator, they're resisting and impeding natural evolutionary gain and loss. And you can take that example across the board. There are many, many industries where incumbents fight to keep their privileged position against some kind of new entrant to the ecosystem, if you will. The third is a cultural aspect, and I think this is one where I think a lot of people overlook it, but I'm increasingly convinced that this is an important factor in a couple of ways. One, I think one of the things that distinguished the U.S. Relative to, say, Europe is that we've had a much more willing embrace of new technology, disruptive technology. The Europeans they don't want GMO products. They don't think the internet is really all that great because it violates your privacy. We've always had this view that we're willing to take risks, and I think, unfortunately, that's becoming under threat. Let me read a quote from the Smithsonian Magazine, that bastion of neo-Ludditism. Obviously being a little facetious, but they had an article in the Smithsonian, which I only pick on because you can read these articles in scientific, in a number of different magazines now. And the article said, quote, "The original Luddites would answer that we are human. Getting past the myth and seeing their protest more clearly is a reminder that it's possible to live well with technology, but only if we continually question the ways it shapes our lives." I don't know about you, but the Luddites, to me, were basically Luddites. You know, they were saying, we don't want new technology. We want to keep our old bad jobs doing weaving. Thank God we don't have to buy clothes that were made by weavers because they'd all cost $4,000. So this notion, I think, of Ludditism is really rampant in the economy, and I think it's a key component. Lastly, we need to think about removing and limiting government barriers to evolution itself. There's a lot of different ways to do that. This, I think, comes out in 2 main areas. One is in competition policy, where we still have this old-fashioned view of competition or antitrust policy that tends to suspect large entities, even though large entities are increasingly disrupted by innovation. And last component of that is just the regulatory system isn't really designed in a way to spur evolution or innovation. It's designed around protection, and it needs to be able to do both. So in terms of a set of intelligent design policies, let me just quickly go through those. One, I think, that's quite controversial is this notion of limiting traded sector loss. If you ask, again, conventional economists, and you say, should we do anything to perhaps keep some of the steel industry here or some of the furniture industry here? The answer will be no. Let those industries go. And I think we need to have a more nuanced view of industry loss. And I think we should ask two critical questions when we're looking at an industry that we're losing. One is, are we losing it because of natural market forces? Well, just low-wage labor in another country. Or are we losing it because of predation? Are we losing it because of specific policies that other countries are putting in place to attack that industry and gain share? And secondly, is there a possibility for the industry to move back up the product cycle? Could it automate? I think the best case in point was in the 1980s when we were losing semiconductor production to the Japanese. The Japanese had a closed market. They were massively subsidizing their semiconductor industry. Our semiconductor industry was at severe risk. And what we did is we created an institution called Semitech, which was supported by both sides of the aisle. It helped the industry retool and re-innovate. And lo and behold, we're the world leaders in semiconductors. So we didn't take the neoclassical advice back then and say, oh, we're losing it to the Japanese, let it go. And thank God we didn't, because now we have an incredibly vibrant and dynamic industry. And then just a couple other points. This goes back to the critical need for expanding federal support for research, science, STEM education. These are all things that drive evolution, that enable organizations to be able to do more. And then finally, this notion of enact policy support organizations. Why would we think that organizations would not want to evolve? Right? We have competition. We've got all these factors that would suggest that organizations on their own should want to evolve. And yet, increasingly, they don't do that. And why don't they do that? I think one of the biggest factors is the rise of short-termism because of financial markets. Financial markets are pressing firms to take short-term decisions rather than long-term evolutionary decisions. A good example of that is that U.S. companies today invest less in basic research than they used to. They invest less in training their workers. They invest about 30% less in new machinery and equipment than they did 3 decades ago. So companies are making rational choices for themselves, but irrational choices for the entire evolutionary system. And that's a role for intelligent design, if you will, to lean against the wind and help drive companies to make different kinds of choices. So let me just conclude by essentially saying economies evolve. That's pretty clear. And if economic thinking and economic policy does not evolve in parallel, we risk essentially doing the wrong things that might have fit an old economy. One of the things in Mike Lynn's book, Mike talks about the rise of different republics, if you will, in the U.S. system. The Third Republic after the Civil War, and the Fourth Republic after the New Deal. And when we went to the New Deal, we had a major debate about what's the form of economic policy we should have. And it was emblematic between this debate between Hayek on the right, who said we should really keep the Third Republic system, small government, small corporations, and Keynes, who was saying, no, we need a new kind of governance system. And I would argue today we're really in that need of a same kind of debate. We're at the same sort of inflection point. And rather than what we're doing today, which is just recycling that old Hayek-Keynes debate, that's largely the debate we have in the financial and economic press today. We need to be thinking about, is there a new kind of thinking that we could have that would transcend those debates? And I would argue that evolutionary thinking, the kind that all three of the panelists have been talking about, is what we should be doing. So thank you. With that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Rob. It was a real challenge taking part in this symposium. because I had to find points on which I disagree with Rob. And so I have good news and bad news. The bad news is this booklet, Understanding and Maximizing America's Evolutionary Economy, is probably the best single guide to the entire subject for the educated layperson as well as the policy practitioner that I can remember reading. And that's bad news because it means it makes it even more of a challenge for me to find a few things to disagree with. So let me begin by endorsing it in a very articulate and comprehensive way. This touches on the fundamentals of economic theory, how this influences different political worldviews, and finally policy prescriptions of the kind we just witnessed. So that's the bad news. The good news is I have found a few things to disagree with, and it's more a matter of emphasis than outright disagreement. And let me begin with the politics of this. In his last slide, Rob said today's economic debate is mostly Keynes versus Hayek. I think that's accurate if you're looking at the debate within the elite prestige press, where the subject is what repertory of policy tools should be used in combating the Great Recession, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and so on. I think in the public as a whole, what you're seeing is what I would call Brandeis and Bryan. Louis Brandeis, the great progressive thinker of a century ago, and William Jennings Bryan, the great agrarian populist. And I think these traditions, which have existed continuously since their era, are resurfacing both on the left and on the right. On the right, as you've seen recently with the tax on large corporations and on the Export-Import Bank and so on, the term crony capitalism, which a decade or two ago was used only in the context of East Asian government business collaboration, has now become a rallying cry for a group of Tea Party conservatives. I think they're just conservatives at this point, attacking what the Republican Party traditionally supported, which was government support for big business and for industry and export promotion on everything from the Ex-Im Bank to more skilled immigration for Silicon Valley and other topics. I think the reason why I call this Bryanism is because if you look at a political map, the red states of today, the Republican base, were the base of the Democratic Party a century ago. And this is the old Jeffersonian, Jacksonian heartland of the South and parts of the lower Midwest and the West. And this Jeffersonian ideology of small producerism has always been extraordinarily powerful in American culture, but particularly in the South and the West. And so I think that as the center of gravity of the Republican Party has shifted southward and westward, and as former Democrats have converted to the Republican Party, they brought this Jefferson-Jackson tradition with them. If you look at the blue states, heirs to the progressive tradition, you get a similar small is beautiful kind of approach, which comes from a different historical and philosophical tradition. I'm sure you've all had the experience of listening to National Public Radio, which is often thought of as a bastion of complacent left liberalism. And the program is all about how we should make more preserved jellies like our grandparents, right? Or go back to using traditional heirloom beans of the 17th century sort. And as a child of the 60s New Deal tradition, I find myself in the 21st century wondering what is left and what is right, because the people who call themselves the progressives, they want to go back to fixed rail mass transit, right? They want to blow up dams on behalf of the environment. And when you put all of these things together, you have a center left which appears to have problems with the second industrial revolution. Let's forget the third industrial revolution of computers and the internet, but of automobiles and dams and rural electrification, all those classic Franklin Roosevelt programs. So I would simply amend that. I think at the popular level, and you have a convergence, because on more and more issues, the Brandeisian left and the Bryanist right tend to agree that anything big is sinister and conspiratorial, and this is a problem because the core technologies, the ones that drive the most productivity growth, tend to be ones with increasing returns to scale, where they are big because they're efficient, not because they've bought off legislators. So that's one area of amplification, if not of disagreement. A couple of more areas which are more quibbles than criticism. One of the points in the book, don't impede natural evolutionary loss, I think is profoundly important. You don't want your public policies slowing down the transition from one Schumpeterian techno-economic paradigm to the next. And one of the often neglected ways you can do this is to design your welfare state and your income maintenance programs in a way that anesthetizes people against disruptive, technology-driven occupational change. And this point is almost never raised here in Washington or elsewhere in discussions about the future of the welfare state. It tends to be driven by ideology. Liberals want more universal, progressively paid-for programs. Conservatives tend to want some kind of voucherized, privatized system or system of accounts. And it's all driven by ideology. Unions, public and private sector, want employer-based pensions, right? But I think from a point of view of minimizing political resistance against occupational and industrial churn, what you want is a portable system. At the New America Foundation, we call this citizen-based or individual-based, so that if you lose your job, you do not lose your health care, you do not lose your retirement savings. If your entire industry is destroyed, then you can be retrained and go to work in a new industry, but you haven't had this great catastrophic life event of not having health insurance. And the Affordable Care Act helps somewhat reduce the job lock, the dependency. And I'll just mention in wrapping up this point that if you look at the economies of Western Europe, the so-called corporatist economies such as France and Germany, in which benefits depend to a much greater degree on a particular employer, arguably tend to be less dynamic than the Scandinavian or Nordic democracies, where you have universal tax-based welfare states and income maintenance systems, so that it doesn't really matter. You're not going to lose your health care or your be impoverished in retirement if your industry is wiped out or if your company fails. Now, my final and most and largest emendation or amplification has to do with national security. Rob says we should support global integration based on firms' market-based choices rather than the decisions of government. And at the same time, we should slow the loss of traded sector industry where it makes sense. And he comes up with a very persuasive dichotomy between good offshoring, you could call it, or bad offshoring. You want to keep the very high value added aspects of global supply chains, and particularly the ones that have multiplier effects in the rest of the economy. On the other hand, there really are routinized, commoditized, aspects of production that could be offshored with no danger to economic competitiveness. But the assumption of this discussion is that you're talking about civilian economic competitiveness in a world in which companies are competing for market share. They're not mortal military rivals. Now, why is this important? Well, first of all, it's important for historical reasons. For most of the history of the industrial era, the great powers have been at each other's throats. And as Rob notes in passing, military-related R&D helped certainly accelerate both the development and the diffusion of general-purpose technologies, jets and radar and computers in the Cold War, and so on.
Siri not available. Connect to the internet. Sorry.
But the other factor is, I think that you have to treat national security as a third independent criterion, because when national security is a factor, this distinction that Rob makes between, I think, evolutionary and devolutionary offshoring, which I think makes sense in terms of competition among friendly allies like the US and Japan, or the US and the European Union. It just breaks down if you have potential military rivals like China or Russia, for example. So, for example, rare earths, this is just mining highly polluting minerals. And there'd be an excellent case for just importing it from abroad if there weren't strategic considerations. So why is this particularly urgent at this moment? If I didn't bring slides with me, but if I had, I would have brought one that I use sometimes showing the increasing convergence of trade blocs with national security alliances. So if you look at the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and then superimpose that on the NATO military alliance, it's pretty much the same. It's the US and its European partners excluding Russia. If you look at the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it's largely America's, not completely, but it's largely America's military allies in East Asia, excluding China. China, for its part, is promoting something called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a pan-Asian trading bloc, which, not coincidentally, excludes the United States. In a world in which you're getting a resurgence of multipolar competition, then I just think you have to add that additional thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Eric, great. I've got a couple slides. I'm just going to speak them up here. First, thank you, Rob, for having me. It's a pleasure to be on a panel with Dick and Michael. It's a terrific paper, and I should say I admire you for taking on such a big topic. If you keep this up, you guys are going to ruin Washington's reputation for being superficial and short term. It's terrific you're willing to take these very fundamental issues on. And since I agree with most of the paper, my remarks are going to be aimed at extending it a little bit rather than criticizing it. And I'm going to just briefly touch on three questions. One, is economic evolution real? Is this just a theory or a metaphor, or can we actually see real evidence for this? Second, a few thoughts on how it works, and then finally, a few personal reflections on what it means for policy. So just one way of kind of starting off on the is it real question, I would start by looking at this little gadget in my pocket. I'm afraid this isn't one of the latest ones, but it's an iPhone. And the economist Brian Arthur likes to say all technology is built out of other technologies. So if you think about what's in this iPhone, it's a little ecosystem of semiconductors, radio technology, touch-sensitive screen, GPS, software, etc., kind of combined in this particular form. And if you look inside each of those things, the semiconductors or the GPS or whatever, you'll find another little ecosystem of parts and modules and so on. And the way technology evolves is through a combination and recombination of technologies being put into new forms to make newer technologies and newer technologies and newer technologies. If you actually think about what this thing really is, it's a couple 100 kilograms of mostly sand. That's what's in this. Sand and a little, bit of copper and aluminum and, some rare earths. And what makes that sand and metal into this sophisticated thing is how those have been combined into all these different technologies, kind of building up this tree. And we should also note that as technologies evolve, they create the needs for new technology. So when this thing was invented, no one had heard of the word app before. There was no job app developer, it didn't exist. And then all of a sudden this thing gets invented as a new kind of general platform, and we create the needs for all sorts of new things to go with it. My favorite is, I saw on Amazon, you can actually buy gloves now for when the weather's cold that work on the touchscreen. Now, of course, before this thing was invented, no one ever needed gloves that worked on a touchscreen. So there's this kind of self-feeding process that goes in technology innovation. Now, I'm going to show a little bit of data about how this process has worked over the very long term in the U.S. economy. And this is using patent data. And patent data is highly imperfect data. It doesn't include services. It doesn't actually, a lot of technologies are never patented. Weird things happen with these days patent wars and other things. But taking those caveats into account, you can think of it as like a fossil record of technologies in the past. And just like the fossil record in biology is an imperfect reflection of life, the life that existed. This is an imperfect fossil record, but it's still interesting. So if I could have the first slide. So when we look in the patent record, you see this process of combination and recombinations, because each patent has to tell what other patents and technologies are built into that patent. So this is a patent for something to do with smartphones, I think. And you can see that this patent, in turn, is a little network. It's calling on things like recording apparatus for television cameras, camera and recording devices, answering machines, compression technologies, synchronous satellite communication. So this particular patent is made up of new combinations of a whole bunch of other technologies and old patents. And we can actually trace the evolution of these networks of patents and combinations over time. And if you go to the next slide, please, you can also calculate, if we take all of the patent codes, all the things that have been invented, and think of the total possible combinations that could be made out of them, it's a huge, huge number. And it's actually that black line going up the top. And then the red line shows the number that we've actually patented, the number we've actually exploited. So you can think of a space of possibility out of all the stuff we know, and then what have we actually made out of that space of possibility. And you see that this kind of space of knowledge, and I should note this is a log graph, so this is actually a super exponential, it's not just an exponential curve. So knowledge is literally exploding. This is a bit of an answer to the naysayers saying, all the good inventions have been made, because we're only actually exploiting a very small fraction of the space of knowledge we already have, and that space of knowledge is growing in this kind of super exponential fashion. And then if we look at how we explore this technology possibility space, we can go to the next slide. This is a graph in 1880 of all the kind of patent codes and how they're related to each other. And you can see the gray shading that almost all the patents were mechanical. 1800s, that's where most of the innovation action was. But you see this little sort of blue thing hanging off the end, kind of not very big, electrical stuff, which was new at the time, just being invented. And now if we kind of fast forward, go to the next slide, 1910, well, we see it's still pretty much a mechanically driven economy, these kind of big clusters of core general platforms of mechanical technologies, but the blue stuff is starting to get bigger and branching out. And also we see this branch up here of green stuff, chemicals start to become big. Now if we go to the next one, 1930s, again, it's still largely a mechanical economy, and what's at the center is kind of where most of the action is. But we see this kind of core of mechanical activity, but now this quite big branch of electrical stuff, and another big branch of chemical, and then kind of hanging off the chemical, we start seeing drug and medical stuff picking up as well. Now we go to the next one. So 1960s, and now we've got a real sort of phase shift going on. Mechanical is still kind of at the center and the biggest, but now these other branches, again, the electrical, now we've got, it's harder to see with the shading, but electronics and computers and communications start coming in, and a very big drug biomedical branch coming off. And then if we go to the next one, by 1980s, we've had a flip. And the kind of electrical and electronics is now at the core of the economy. The mechanical stuff is kind of getting pushed out to the periphery, and you have this also very big branch again of the chemical, drug, and medical. And then if we go to the last one, I think we see chemicals and biomeds going through real growth, life sciences, and then the next one, I think it's the last one, 2010. We see that really dominated by computers and communications at the center of the economy, and the mechanical stuff is now out in the periphery. And if we could just go to the next slide, you can really see through this data these eras of evolutionary technological change. The dots are the actual patent codes, and the shades are the number of patents. And so you see this kind of mechanical era, this sort of burst of innovation here around electrical, with sort of chemical and life sciences taking off, and then at the very end, the kind of computer revolution. So we can see exactly the kind of process that Rob described in data from the economy. And so what we have is this kind of constant search through these combinatorial spaces of possibility. And it can only be evolutionary, because we can't predict what's going to work. So there has to be a process of experimentation going on, and lots of failure as well as successes. Now we can also, think of this kind of search through spaces of possibilities in terms of products, in terms of capabilities, in terms of even how we organize the economy. And when you put these together, you start to get a picture of how the economy has not only kind of grown in scale, what we see in the GDP numbers, but in variety. If you look at Amazon has 150 million products now on its website, different individual products. The average Walmart store has, I think, about a million products in it. There's 300 cable TV channels and still nothing good to watch. So we've had this explosion in the kind of variety in the economy as well as scale. And so now if we think about, if we sort of start to think of this as kind of a core part of how the economy works, we can ask a few questions about policy. And I would say, this kind of thinking hasn't really gotten deep into the policy thinking. So again, it's terrific that ITIF is pushing this agenda because we need more work on it. But I'll offer a few thoughts. I would agree with both speakers that this is neither a left or right issue. In fact, I think this framework helps explain why a lot of stuff both the left and right have pursued hasn't worked very well. So, for example, the old sort of industrial policy kind of stuff on the left of picking winners doesn't work in a framework like this because, if you were sitting in 1880, you couldn't have predicted, where that graph was going to go or where the winners were going to be. You can't predict evolutionary processes very well. And likewise, on the right, this idea that we can just sort of set the table and people will dine. If we just deregulate and have low taxes and so on, that this will all kind of work out through market forces. That what we saw in those graphs was that particular clusters of the economy matter a lot more than others, or sort of more central to the innovation process. They're the general technology platforms. They're the kind of core clusters where innovation is happening, and and if we have a kind of hollowing out or loss of competitiveness in those core areas, or if we're not encouraging the innovation process, that we can lose out, as we have seen in key sectors of the economy. It also, another lesson that comes out from this being an evolutionary process is you can't really skip steps. I'm based in the UK, and there they've had a history of saying we have deprived areas, like in Wales or other places, and so we'll pop a biotech cluster in the middle of nowhere, in Wales. And what they don't realize is that's kind of, there's no kind of ecosystem around it. That the evolution of that economy hasn't gone in that direction, and so you can't sort of just skip steps. So the best policies are ones that encourage an acceleration of evolutionary processes that are happening through the market and builds on these general platforms and clusters. And I think this is kind of behind the logic of things like DARPA, NSF, NIH. And in many ways, actually, the U.S. has done this kind of stuff pretty well, better than many other countries, where we've had mission-driven innovation programs that help accelerate this process of evolution, support kind of core clusters of innovation, and the creation of new platforms. Also, if you look at the innovation policies pursued in many parts of Asia, it starts to become clear why some of that stuff has worked pretty well too. If you look at how Korea, for example, didn't pick winners, didn't choose Samsung or LG, but it made a strategic decision it wasn't going to get its clock cleaned, by China and emerging Asian economies in commodity semiconductors, and helped the industry essentially evolve up the value chain and build the next set of skills and clusters. In particular, for example, product design skills. So, 15 years ago, no one would have called Korean products the most beautifully designed products. Now you walk into a shop and the Samsung televisions look gorgeous and the smartphones rival Apple's. So we can see policies that can help accelerate these processes. So just by way of closing, I would note that the macro environment still matters. Taxes, incentives, investments in infrastructure, education. I'm not saying that stuff isn't important. That provides a base, but But we can, if we think about this in the kind of thoughtful ways in Rob's paper, think of ways and policies that can help accelerate this process of evolution and also help remove the barriers. And lastly, I would note that one of the key things that will help us accelerate it is the education system and the way we think about skills. And right now, our education system is essentially an industrial revolution education system. You get all your training, between the until age 18 or 22, and then you're supposed to be done for life. But if this process of evolution is accelerating in the way that we're seeing, we need to really fundamentally rethink that to allow our skill base to evolve and accelerate along with technology innovation. Thank you.
Thank you. Dick, are you still with us?
I'm still with you.
Wonderful. You're up.
Well, as I reflected on what I was going to say today, I tried to anticipate the wide range of things that Rob and Michael and Eric were going to say, so I could essentially avoid duplicating that. And despite their great range, I think I've managed to avoid following their lines and identify some things that I thought were relevant to the broad theme that Rob is introducing today. I'm going to make some brief remarks on three topics. First, a bit on how evolutionary economics fits into the history of economic thought. Second, I'm going to propose that we have not digested sufficiently that modern economies are very mixed economic systems, involving a lot more than just markets. And third, I want to end with some observations on innovation policy. Some of our more orthodox colleagues in economics think of evolutionary economics as an intellectually radical departure from more traditional economic thinking, and I would like to propose that just is not true. That there has been a strong evolutionary strand of thinking well before Darwin in the history of economic thought. Those of you who have read it will recall that Adam Smith begins his Wealth of Nations by his famous example of innovation in pin making and of the tremendous effects that had on pin making and on he clearly meant this as an indication of what was going on in manufacturing activities more broadly in the Great Britain of his days. And if you read many of the great classical economists following Smith, their focus, like Smith, is on basically how economies are growing and changing over the long run. With the rise of neoclassical economics in the last parts of the 19th century, there was an increasing focus on maximization and on equilibrium conditions. Well, I think what is interesting about that is that becomes so influential within neoclassical economics, largely because it's mathematically tractable. And in a sense, the building of various mathematical formalisms tended to make people think that the economy really worked that way. But while that was happening, and with long-run influences on what happens in the economics profession, there are a lot of economists who are taking an evolutionary perspective on things. Rob has mentioned Schumpeter, and that's obviously right. But as I suggested, there are economists before Schumpeter that are interested in innovation and technical change. Well, Alfred Marshall is often considered to be one of the real leaders that moved neoclassical economics into the dominant position that it gained in the United States and the UK. If you read him closely and read his industry and trade as well as his principles, he is basically interested in long-run economic dynamics. Maybe my friend Stan Metcalf has gone too far in proposing that Marshall was actually a closet evolutionist. But he certainly wanted to go in that direction. And the American Institutional Economics School, which played such an important role in American economics from the beginning of the 20th century until after World War II. Many of them are explicitly evolutionary in spirit and in analysis. From this point of view, I would like to propose that evolutionary economics is what mainline economics actually was tending toward and might have become, but it didn't. And that's a problem. And in response to Rob's question, no, I don't see that much signs that it's about ready to change now. Let me switch to my second issue, which I think is just extremely important and needs to get more into economic thinking than it has. The current conventional formulation in economics of how modern economies are organized is that they are market economies. The emphasis is on their own market economies. And there's some recognition that there are some non-market institutions here and there, government policies, government programs, defense, things of that sort. However, they're in there awkwardly, and they're there because of market failure. So you have this image of an economy that is almost exclusively a market economy, except when it doesn't work that well. It fails, and you bring in other types of institutions and public policy. What an incredibly biased perspective that is on modern economies. Think of schools, national defense, roads, police, the courts, science, the care of children, an enormous range of activities that go on with market influences secondary, basically governed through non-market structures. We care for children largely in families because of market failure. The notion that these activities are out there somehow or other as exceptions to the rule, and markets could only if they could only take care of it, that would do better. It seems to me is just a very, very odd way of thinking about the complex mixed economy that we in fact have. And I observe, to move closer to what Rob is interested in this session, and observing that many of our most progressive sectors are highly mixed sectors. Medical care, for example. Pharmaceuticals is a mixed sector. If you look at where most of the original research, basic research that feeds into pharmaceuticals is done, it's done in universities and is funded through the National Institutes of Health. Airlines, they fly out of public airports and have an extremely complicated system of regulation and forecast and monitoring that is largely public. We have a strikingly mixed economic system. Our economy is essentially a mixed one, and not because the markets fail in some sense, but because different types of institutions can do different types of things well. Markets do certain kinds of things well, and other types of institutions do other things very well. We've just got to recognize this and get out of the habit of thinking that what we have here is a market system with exceptions. To turn to innovation, there's a notion that economic innovation is basically a market-induced and structured activity. Well, large parts of it are, but large parts of it aren't. Again, think about pharmaceuticals or aircraft. The basic formulation of the modern aircraft in the United States basically came out of the old NACA, established after World War I and continued after World War II under the auspices of the Department of Defense. This is a group at this gathering that knows a lot about the history of electronics. And modern electronics essentially grows up and is supported in its early stages and continues to be supported by government activity and funding and university research. When I taught the industrial organization course at Yale many years ago, I observed to the students in that class that you really couldn't understand electronics unless you understood and mentioned something about the electrical engineering departments at Stanford and at MIT. And you couldn't understand them unless you understood the Department of Defense. They made similar arguments about pharmaceuticals. Government agencies and policies play a major role in each of these industries. However, to pick up on what Eric was observing, if you look at the roles that they play, they do not engage in detailed planning, because nobody can do that in an evolutionary system. There is very little in the way of picking particular winners, but rather what you have is selective, supportive policies with government agencies sometimes leading. I will also observe that if you look at those industries and others where government innovation policy has played an enormously powerful role, like agriculture, that these effective policies and programs differ very significantly from sector to sector. And regarding innovation policy at the microeconomic level, the notion that there's a single policy that will work across the board strikes me as really very ill informed. Anyhow, let me break my conversation now so that we'll have some opportunity for discussion.
Great, thank you, Dick. And sort of in the instance of time, I won't respond really, other than to say I agreed with everything everybody said, including Mike, your comments about the fence. I think that's right, and the safety net. So why don't we just open it up and raise your hand, identify yourself. I'll call on orders right here, Joel.
Yeah, my name is Joel Yudkin. I run a consultancy called High Rate Strategies in Arlington. I'm very much interested in this. It's been an avocation studying evolutionary and complexity economics, and because I think we need a new paradigm in economics, and I'm wondering when we're going to get there. I work a lot with economic modelers, and most of those models are very much tied to the traditional neoclassical theory, and I think that's why some of our policy recommendations leave a lot to be desired. But I have a couple of just questions, and I'll try to be fast there, Rob. One is, when we talk about evolution, I did hear three important terms. Now, maybe one that are really tied to the notion of evolution, because I've studied a lot of biological evolution, try to understand how does it apply to economic evolution. And one is there's mutation, which I guess we could call innovation. Two is adaptation, and three, selection. And it seems to me that the forces of selectivity and adaptation are really the key to determine whether or not an innovation is going to go somewhere or not. And this, like you're talking about, there's a whole process of selection that went into all the materials, all the technologies, and everything that made the iPhone. So that's one question, and I think that's important to understand those dynamics is even more important today to kind of come up with a better way of maybe better theory on this.
So
or better application.
I'll hold you to one question because I want to get everybody. So let's just respond to that. Eric, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I'll make just a brief response.
I think we have to be a bit careful applying biology to economic evolution. They're two very different realms. They're both evolutionary, but evolutionary in very different ways. And this is something Dick has written quite a bit about. I think at the core, though, there are these processes of differentiation. So, out there in the smartphone market, there's a whole variety of ways of doing smartphones that you have to choose from. There's a selection process. We'll like some things better than others. Some will be cheaper, more expensive, more functional. And there's an amplification process that the stuff that sells well gets sort of scaled up and innovated on more. So, and that at its core, differentiation, selection, amplification is a Darwinian loop. So now the way it plays out in the economy is Rob talked about is very different. We have rational or intentional rather people trying to improve things. It's not a random process the way it is in biology. The kind of units of selection are different. There's no equivalent necessarily of species or and there's no sex, unfortunately, in the economy. It is a different process, but it's evolutionary nonetheless.
We'll go in the order I heard him. So right here, back here.
I'm Chris Tucker. Weirdly, I'm one of Dick's old doctoral students from the previous century. He's going to be on here. Hi, Dick.
I'm here.
So, a lot of times people use the term co-evolutionary, not just evolutionary, because it's the co-evolution of the industry's core technology, its industry structure, and its supporting institutions. And Dick kind of referred to that a little bit. So where in, I guess this is to Rob, or anybody who wants to chime in your thinking on this and the bills that are coming up that you were mentioning, how are you thinking about those supporting institutions? Dick talked about them a little bit, but particularly the institutions that help shape the rate and direction of scientific advance and technical change that underpin broad sectors. So not picking winners and losers in any way, shape, or form, but how are you thinking about those sectorally in terms of those core technologies and their co-evolution with the industry structure and supporting institutions over time? Because as we saw from your slides, those patent information, they change over time, decade by decade. They're materially different, and we have to think about them through space and time and sectorally.
Yeah, so a couple things. We don't know in particular exactly what the technology is going to be. And we don't know in computing, is it going to be quantum? It probably will be, but we don't really know. But we do know, for example, in computing that we need to move beyond what's called CMOS and Moore's law. We need to get to some other system. And so the role of an evolutionary policy would be to seed those things, to say, okay, we're going to put a lot of bets here. Same thing with battery technology. We don't know is it going to be lithium ion, is it going to be air or whatever it is. We don't know. We're clueless. Someone will figure this out, but so we got to place a lot of bets. So I do think government or the society has enough information to say in big directions like those patent lines. Okay, it looks like there's a lot going on here. So we're going to fund more of that than we might fund something else. I think in terms of the institutions, what we want to do is we want to have our institutions be more supportive of evolution. And so things like the movement now of many universities over the last decade to think more systematically about their interaction with industry and entrepreneurial activity. Many, many universities are doing a better job than they were a decade ago. Public policy has helped support that. So I think what we want more explicit institutions. One last example of that is the bill the House just passed last week, 2 weeks ago, called RAMI.
Revitalizing American Manufacturing Innovation Act.
Thank you. Revitalizing American Manufacturing Innovation. Great example of creating these co-evolutionary institutions like things like 3D printing or digital manufacturing. The idea of the bill is to create a whole bunch more of these. So I think that's one thing we could be doing. I'm going to go here and then here. Ma'am?
Hi, my name is Beth Scott. I have to say I was really struck by Michael's point about the almost disconnect in a way between the intellectual debates of, I think your term was the intellectual elite economists, and then the broader popular debate. And it's really striking too when you have that idea in conjunction with poll after poll over the last few years that have shown a continued loss of faith in institutions, both private and public institutions. So really, this is a very ambitious program that requires a lot of trust. how do you reconcile then actually moving forward and enabling the economy to evolve in the face of popular disconnect and even discontent with the institutions that will be called upon to do it?
Well, I think the key thing is don't have the Secret Service run this program. No, look, a couple of things. I think that the cultural aspects of this are really important, and really what you're talking about is cultural aspects of culture around what we argue in. What I argue in this is this sort of culture of sort of radical individualism and short-termism limits innovation. There's a great line by Edmund Phelps, who's in Columbia, and he argues we should have. It would be great if we had high-tech or CEOs who were more interested in building their companies than building their dream house. In other words, this point about wealth making is different than innovation making. That's in part a cultural. So I do think that besides just having good governance, which we could do better on, and both parties are responsible for that, I think part of the other thing is just, I know it sounds naive, but we need to have a national discussion and dialogue about how do we build a culture again that is more supportive of innovation and of change, of evolution, and the institutions that we need in. That's the only thing I can think of. Mike, do you want to add to that?
Well, my think tank, the New America Foundation, a few years ago commissioned a poll of polls on various economic issues. And we discovered that there was this extraordinary consensus among self-described liberals, centrists, and conservatives that small is beautiful and big is bad, and that you can't trust anyone in power, whether in the private sector or the public sector. And this transcended the partisan divide. And it concerns me, and because for the very reason that what Professor Nelson quite rightly pointed out are the most progressive sectors, tends to be where government, nonprofits such as universities and businesses, both big and small, interact, that this just is alien to a very deeply set, I would call it Jeffersonian producerist mindset in the United States. And I'm pessimistic in the sense that I think a lot of this is simply passed down from parents to children and grandchildren. So in other words, it's not actually a response to what people do. Sometimes we say because of Watergate, people lost faith in American institutions, because of this, because of that. You can make a case that really the mid-20th century was sort of the exception, where because of the perceived success of overcoming the Depression and the success in World War II, there was a generation that held corporations working with business and government in high esteem. And since the 70s, we've kind of reverted back to this older culture of suspicion. And I just think that underlines Rob's emphasis on that you have to take this to the public. It's not simply a matter of persuading elites.
Here and then here.
I wanted to...
Identify yourself.
Oh, sorry. Brian Cahan, CCIA and MIT. I wanted to raise the question of whether scale is being confused with age. So we have had some recent studies associated with Ian Hathaway and various collaborators suggesting that there's been a loss of dynamism, including in the high-tech sector, and including an increasing average age of businesses. And so if you're concerned about dynamism, it would seem to me that age is more important, the dynamism is more important than scale. And yet this discussion has been pretty much focused on scale.
I don't think that, maybe the discussion has, but certainly the booklet has not been. The booklet is about dynamism as well as scale. Only in the sense that scale enables, in declining marginal cost industries, scale is a big deal because each unit you sell after that, you sell at a lower cost, and therefore you can reinvest into innovation. I think Bob Leighton's work on this is really, really interesting, and Bob will admit this. Bob did a study that showed that the number of new business startups is lower than it has been for a long, long time, and going down. And his hypothesis, we had several hypotheses, but he basically said we don't know the answer to that. And I think part of the answer to that, frankly, is that a lot of innovation, a lot of new business startups is about supporting or building off of OEM success. And I think people miss that. In other words, big company success. And I think as we've lost big company success, it's made it harder for the overall ecosystem to emerge or to thrive. So I don't think it's one of those things where it's like, well, we can ignore big companies and just rely on small startups. Small startups thrive off of healthy big companies, and I think that's the ecosystem that we've lost, or we've declined in it. Eric or Dick? Or?
I'll just very briefly add, because you're very much agree with that. One of our postdocs did a very nice study on labor market flows and who are the real job creators in the economy. And you get these debates: is it big companies, small companies? You know, how does this dynamism play out? And what he found was exactly what you said, Rob. It's neither. It is a ecosystem of actually how these things are wired together. You know, big companies and small companies and medium companies, and how they're interacting with each other that leads to the job creation. It's not kind of one or the other. So we really do have to think of it as more like an ecosystem.
Dick, did you have a comment on that? You have any thoughts on that?
I don't think so.
Okay, great. Right here.
Andrew Reamer, George Washington University. I like how Rob marrying evolution and the notion of intelligent design. And an important part of intelligent design in U.S. economic policy over the years has been the aim to support the military. That from Alexander Hamilton's report on manufacturers came out of George Washington's observation that we need a strong manufacturing sector so we can be self-sufficient in arms. And then in the 19th century with the Harper's Ferry and the armories and the development of manufacturing, that was all driven by the fact that rifles fell apart in the field in the War of 1812, and the Army wanted to figure out ways to make these things so you could have interchangeable parts. RCA in 1919 came out of the Navy Department wanting to be sure that the British didn't own the patents for wireless, and they stumbled into the fact that there was commercial radio, 2 years later, but it was just a fluke of intelligent design on the basis of the Navy's needs. At the moment, there is an office in the Defense Department, Office of Manufacturing and Industrial-Based Policy, with the Deputy Assistant Secretary. So my question is, given the long history of intelligent design marrying the military to economic policy, given that there is this Office of Industrial-Based Policy in the Defense Department, and also in the Commerce Department, there is a Bureau of Industry and Security, which, if people are interested, they do an annual survey of firms in manufacturing about their situation their competitive situation. And the BIS is asking for comments on that survey now. So if people want a copy of that, give me your card, I'll get it to you. So my question is, how can these long-standing precedents and these two institutions be used to facilitate the vision that I very much agree with that you're talking about?
Well, Andrew, I think that I relied on a lot of your work when I wrote this last part. The last part of the book was really about we need a better and deeper understanding of the evolutionary system of the U.S. economy, which we don't have. And we have little pieces of it, some in DOD, some in commerce, some other places. But it's not put together in any serious way. It's completely underfunded. There are many, many questions that we don't have. There are many answers to questions that we don't have. So I think, again, part of that would be, again, it sounds so French statist to say this, but we need some place in the government that's thinking systematically about evolution, about where are we, what's happening. And all we have agencies that release, some Excel data sheets every once in a while, and you plow through them and see what you can find. So I think we need to step that up a level, which we haven't quite done. We had more of it in the past, as you've written about. Mike or Eric?
Just a brief comment. Well, first, the phrase intelligent design in the government doesn't always sit well with me, but the way I think about it is it's not so much the kind of rational planner or picking winners, but where we've seen success is when the efforts are focused on solving a problem, some problem for society, what Mariana Mazzucato at Sussex calls mission-driven innovation support. So can we cure cancer, an NIH mission, or can we get to the moon, a NASA mission, or can we defeat terrorists, a DOD mission? And by aligning around some set of societal problems and mobilizing industry and R&D and resources, lots of unexpected things then come out of that. So in trying to defeat terrorists, the image recognition stuff in your iPhone that picks out your daughter's face in a photo came out of the desire to recognize terrorists going through airports and things like that. So we get these large spillover effects from well done mission-driven innovation.
Great point. I agree with your history. I think we're facing sort of a crisis now with the Great Recession and at the end of the Cold War, even before that. Historically, America's military-industrial policy was its civilian-industrial policy. From Hamilton's report on manufacturers, you had a world-class, state-supported, state-subsidized in various ways, advanced manufacturing base, which you then converted to wartime production, and then you went back to civilian production, automobiles to aircraft in World War II. And let me just make a point that we dwell too much on innovation and not enough on production. If you look at Britain, Britain and France and Germany were more innovative than the United States really before World War II. This was not a terribly innovative country. Most of the technology was being developed in the UK, Germany, to a lesser extent in France. If you look at automobiles, it was largely German and French. We mass-produced it behind tariff walls so that instead of importing it. So the factories were here, and then we could switch the manufacturing. So what happened during the Cold War was we broke with our traditional policy of mobilizing civilian industry for military purposes, and we created a separate defense industrial base so that in 2014, when people talk about the defense industrial base, they're actually talking about specialized military contractors. And that was a successful system. It was inadvertently successful because a lot of the spin-offs from military technology, computers and satellites and all kinds of things, then went into the civilian economy. The spending that we're looking at for the Pentagon in the 2020s, absent some new major Cold War, which is possible, is at such low levels. This has consequences of two things. First of all, these defense contractors are not going to be very big, with their one customer being the government. So either they're going to have to branch out and build up their civilian aspects, or they will become very specialized, kind of welfare dependencies of a shrunken defense budget. And the second is that we need to think about the migration of technologies in the other direction, some way to facilitate that. From the private sector tech leaders to the defense industry. And you see, for example, in rocket competition, where Silicon Valley wants to get into that, we're beginning to see this debate. So I think because of restricted defense spending, I think we're going to have to see some kind of serious rethinking of this in a kind that we haven't seen for about 50 or 60 years.
Dick, did you have any closing thoughts before we close?
Just a quick remark on those last remarks. I think Michael would agree, and I think it's very much part of your presentation, Rob, that you really don't want to make a sharp distinction between innovation and production, in that these are activities that blur into each other. I think it's a mistake to have in mind that innovation is a discrete thing that happens from time to time and then gets picked up in production. In fact, in most fields of technology, in most industries that we know about, what you have is processes of continuing minor innovation, learning by using and doing, to use Nate Rosenberg's old language, that interact with R&D, and that the mistake that you observed, Rob, in several places in the report, that American analysts have made when they looked at industries that were in trouble was to assume that those industries were static and to compare the current situation in those industries with that in different countries and not recognize at all that innovation and production are continuing and strongly interactive processes in a number of fields.
Great. No, yeah, absolutely, which we tend to think, you're absolutely right, we tend to think of innovation as this one thing and we can do it and we don't have to worry about production, and the two are interlinked. Let me just close by one last quick comment on this notion of a mission, rather than Mike's comments. Evolution, I think, the notion of economic change is sort of this thing that happens because of welfare maximizing individual choice. And I think the reality is much more that intention matters and having a national mission matters. And when we had a national mission to win the Cold War, that just accelerated innovation. And today we're really lacking this national mission. And I think it's important to have a national conversation what that mission could be. I mean, for me, it would be a few things. I'm not saying these are the right ones, but I think one would be a national mission around a whole new approach to disease based upon genomics and proteomics and really thinking about that next frontier. Secondly, it would be about a new kind of energy system. And third would be about what's called beyond Moore's law, and what's going to replace CMOS. And the fourth would be robotics. I think I'm just super believe that's really critical technology for us to make progress as an economy or a race. Really good robotics, and having a mission helps organize not just resources but intention. And we don't really seem to be able to have a dialogue about that or a conversation without diverting into these sort of false dichotomies between heavy-handed French statism and which even they don't do now, and laissez-faire marketing. So with that, first of all, I want to thank you all for coming and being part of this, but please join me in thanking three great panelists today, Eric, Dick, and Mike. Thank you.
That's great.